Good morning and welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. So today we'll be delving into Singer's view of effective altruism and his justification for accepting a cosmopolitan ethic. As we saw on Monday, there are three different views that we can take concerning answering the question of whether or not we have a duty to help. There's the nationalist framework, there are social contract theory frameworks, and there's also the cosmopolitan framework. We're delving into the cosmopolitan framework because it very much pushed back against the first two. In addition, it forms the logical foundation for justifying a lot of the humanitarian work that NGOs perform. All right, so throughout the week, we talked about global health and what are some of the basic tenets of global health. And then on Wednesday, we discussed non-governmental organizations. And non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, tend to perform the following functions. They tend to help address human rights violations, provide humanitarian aid, help with economic development, such as in the cases of the World Bank and IVF, help shore up or ensure social welfare, improve population health, etc. Now, NGOs and GOs, governmental organizations such as the WHO, developed largely after and out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm just going to read the quote for you here because it highlights the importance of health. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness and disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control, end quote. So here this couches basic needs as a right, and with every right, there is entailed a duty to ensure that such right is fulfilled. So the fundamental starting point of many non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations that come out of the Declaration of Human Rights is that health is one of the most basic human rights. In addition, there's also a hidden premise at the heart of these movements, or dare I say from that quote, an explicit premise that yes, we do have a duty to help. If these things, healthcare, food, security, etc., are couched as rights, then the answer to the do we have a duty to help is in the affirmative. However, there are multiple ways that this question can be answered, as we'll discuss, or as we have discussed, such as those utilizing a nationalist framework, which prioritizes the duties we have to our citizens, a social contract theory, which not only prioritizes the duty that we have to our citizens, but also the importance of maintaining and honoring contracts between nations. And we have cosmopolitanism, which pushes back against, as we'll see, nationalism and social contract theory. So there are clear tensions, and the quote and the foundation for NGOs can very much be seen as a cosmopolitan position. However, what are the justifications for holding a cosmopolitan view? So Peter Singer, in one of his seminal works, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, that's up on Blackboard, he argues, even though he is a utilitarian, he argues that yes, it is all about utility. Yes, we can apply utilitarianism and we do that which benefits the greatest good for the greatest number. However, duty is also important. Recognizing the duty that we have to help others is a key foundation from which we can build a utilitarian ethic, which is effective altruism, as we'll see. So Singer argues that we, in affluent countries like the United States and Australia, which is where he is from, have a moral obligation to give far more than we actually do to bring about food security and better health outcomes, etc., around the world. And this is especially the case when certain countries are facing natural disasters and famines, etc. And we need to drastically alter our way of life in order to help others. And he wrote this piece while he was watching, I believe it was a second or third famine in East Bengal. And he noted that there was a lack of international outpouring and a lack of help to address this very clear humanitarian issue um, occurring. And he thought that this was incredibly unethical. And so he thought, well, it might be a good idea for me to put down my views on why this lack of health is unethical and to point towards a better way of helping others in the future. So there are certain assumptions that Singer's cosmopolitan view is built upon. First assumption is that suffering and death from a lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And here he was quite cheeky because right at the beginning of Famine, Affluence, and Morality, as you saw when you read the piece, after he states that assumption, he's like, we should all agree that suffering and death from the lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And if you don't agree with me, then he said, stop reading now because you're not going to get anything out of the future, the piece that I'm writing. And, honestly, it's a waste of my time. So very cheekily, he was just like, and if you don't agree that with this assumption, you're just not the type of person who would be swayed or interested in anything that I have to say. So you can just save your time now. You can just feel free to save your time and stop reading. So his first assumption is that, yes, suffering and death from a lack of basic necessities is a wrong, and that we should all recognize it as such. His second basic assumption is that if it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening, no matter the distance, whether it's next door, down the block, or across the country, in the case of East Coast, watching the forest fires in California, for example, or across the globe, such as cases with the rise of Ebola, for example, in countries outside of the United States. Well, I should say states, but countries. Also, countries outside of North America, right? We should prevent it, no matter the distance, right? And he utilizes a thought experiment called the drowning child thought experiment to sort of hammer home this assumption. And it goes as follows. I will briefly.
Imagine you're a famous professor. You're all dressed up in a new designer suit and luxurious shoes. Your lecture starts in 15 minutes. On the way to the lecture, you pass a pond. But what's going on here? Without thinking, you jump into the pond and save the child. Your suit and shoes are ruined, and you could forget about your lecture. But it's very clear in your mind that it was the only right thing to do. Of course, a child's life is more important than the suit, the shoes, and the successful lecture. After your act of heroism, you come home and find a letter in your mailbox from an aid organization. It is asking you to donate to starving children in Nigeria. 10 francs will feed a child for an entire month. Without the 10 francs, the boy will die. Do you donate? No? You won't donate 10 francs for a child in Africa, but you'll jump into a pond and not think twice about sacrificing your expensive designer clothes to save a child's life. But there is a difference, you say. But why? Are African children too far away? Let's assume that one of your friends is on a safari in Africa with his son. His son is injured, and his life is in danger. Your friend asks you to send money right away so that the child can be treated in a local hospital. You would send the money, wouldn't you? So, geographical distance doesn't make a difference. Or maybe you don't donate because you aren't sure that the money will actually reach the starving child. Perhaps it could fall into the wrong hands. But if you send the money for your friend's child, you still couldn't be sure if it would be seized by corrupt officials in the process or not. Would that stop you from sending money to your friend? It's clear to you that you had to save a drowning child. Do you also have to donate to charity?
So this thought experiment for Singer, he argues that this supports the position that we should accept the second basic assumption, that if it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening, no matter the distance, then we should prevent it. However, this still begs the question, right? Because it is a thought experiment, and thought experiments are contentious precisely because there are different ways to answer the question, right? So after having seen the thought experiment, gone through this, would you save the child? And do you agree with Singer that this translates into a general duty to help all those who need help, no matter the distance? And what are some of the critiques of the view, and do they hold? And this is something that we can definitely discuss in the discussion forum, and that we will be discussing at Friday's lecture. But I wanted to bring it up here as well. So after discussing the drowning child thought experiment and using that as a justification for his basic assumption, Singer argues that, well, if you hold both of these assumptions, if you accept them, and this is a big if, right? It's a conditional. If you accept them, then you need to accept, logically, one of the two principles to help guide your life. And he gives us a strong principle and a weak principle. And he thinks that the stronger principle is the one to hold. However, the weaker principle will do a lot of work if we even just accepted the weaker principle. So the strong principle goes as follows. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. And here it's important to note comparable moral importance because there's a lot of weight that is placed on this. If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. So what he's basically saying, because when we think of what things are comparably morally important, he's like, well, there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the world. And because we accepted the drowning child thought experiment, that we should help people no matter the distance, we have a duty to address these negative outcomes. And we have a duty to give until we reach a position where we are in the same situation. So we have a moral duty to give until we reach a state of comparable moral importance, which would mean until we are also hungry, or until we also do not have health care, or until we also do not have shelter. And as such, that is our duty. Now, he recognizes that while he thinks this is the view, this is the one that we should take, that very few people would actually endorse this particular position. But he's like, wait, we can also accept a weaker version of this, and it will do a lot of good in the world, but it will be more palatable to the public. And the weaker principle goes as follows. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. So, for example, we can ask, well, why are these different? And why is the difference important? Well, he replaced here morally comparable with morally significant. So in the case of the strong principle, we should give until we are in the situation that we are trying to address, or right before that point. In the weaker principle, we should give until we're negatively impacting or sacrificing something that's morally significant to us. So, for example, if we have a duty we made a promise to go to our child's, well, your child's, my child's, a child's recital, and if providing help to another person would cause us to break said promise, that in that situation, we're giving up something morally significant in order to help the other person. And as such, that would break the weaker principle. So, in cases where there's a conflict between moral duties, we are basically off the hook with the weaker alternative, where we do not have to provide help in those situations. But Singer argues even with this, except by accepting this much weaker position of only providing aid when it doesn't conflict with morally significant stuff such as breaking promises, etc., will still greatly increase the amount of aid and greatly increase the amount of people that we're helping. And so while Singer argues that yes, the first principle should be the one that's adopted, the second principle will do a lot of good. Although I do want to note that Singer himself does not ascribe to the strong principle, at least through his life actions. So the weak Singer principle is weaker in two respects. It concerns only the very bad outcomes that we could prevent, and it lets us off the hook whenever preventing harm would require us to sacrifice anything of moral significance. So now that we've gone through some of the justifications for cosmopolitanism, at least Singer's version of cosmopolitanism, would you support either of these principles, if any, and why? And do you think that Singer provides a good case for providing aid, especially outside of national boundaries? Now, there is one counter argument that we could look at, that Singer does look at. And the counter argument is that Singer's analysis conflicts with our prevailing standards of charity. We already do provide aid, and we do it because we're providing charity. And charity is definitely beyond duty, and it's beyond what's obligatory. That's what part and parcel of what makes charity good. It's the fact that you are giving when you don't have to. You're providing aid and help when it's not precisely when it is not required of you. And as such, we already have this charity systems in place, and so why are we trying to replace one ethical concept with another ethical concept? And Singer pushes back against this and argues that we need to revise our way of thinking, and that giving to famine relief should be thought of as a duty, that we're morally required to do so and not as charity. So again, should giving be a duty, or should giving be a charity? And that's the question that is at the heart of this counter argument. And it's still a very much a live question, right? Singer argues that it should very much be seen as a duty, but there's a whole camp that sees charity as important in and of itself. And so which position should we focus on? Now, effective altruism takes this cosmopolitan foundation that we do have a duty to help and connects it with utilitarianism to help maximize the good that is being done when we provide aid. So Singer argues that utilitarianism can help guide our actions so that we can do the most good with our resources and help the most people. So it's all about utility and duty for Singer, right? Yes, we have a duty to help. We have a duty to provide aid. But part and parcel of ethical rationing is ensuring efficiency. And in the same token, when we're talking about providing aid, when we apply this or include a utilitarian framework in this, efficiency is key. Ensuring that every dollar does the most amount of good for Singer is an ethical mandate. And so for him, he argues that we need to utilize utilitarian frameworks in order to do this. So I have a brief video that I want to show you that I was showing the class that just basically goes over effective altruism. And then I will leave you with a few questions here.
outsider looked at our world, they'd wonder what on earth we are doing. We have plenty enough resources to fix all the worst problems. We're just not using them right. This isn't exactly the fault of particular individuals. It's just that our world is driven by systems that maximize values different from those ones that we actually most care about. For example, the businesses that dominate the market are those that are best at maximizing profit. The politicians we get are those who are best at maximizing their chances of getting elected. And the stories we're most likely to see and read in the media are those that were best at maximizing the likelihood that people would want to read and share them. In the long run, this is bad because values we might care about more, like the environment or the welfare of workers in factories or our access to true and useful information, get bulldozed out of the way. I'm going to tell you about a system that doesn't do this. A system that allows us to direct our resources to exactly what we believe is most important. And that system is effective charitable giving. I say effective because it's not usually obvious which charities are actually doing the most good. And in the usual charity ecosystem, the charities that thrive are those that are best at getting people to give them money, not necessarily the ones that are actually best at making the world a better place. However, through research and transparency, it is possible to locate charities that are incredibly good at improving things. Schistosomiasis Control Initiative doesn't get a lot of funding because it's a weird disease with a long name, and the 200 million people who are infected are mostly incredibly poor, so no one's ever heard of it. But we know reliably that Schistosomiasis Control Initiative can treat one child for a debilitating parasitic infection for just 50p. And deworming doesn't just improve health. Surprisingly, it's much better for improving educational outcomes than more obvious things like scholarships or giving textbooks to schools. A £70 donation to SCI will get 150 months of education for children living in poverty. Or, you could use that money to buy what? 3 meals out? Because we're so used to this world, in which hardly any resources are actually invested in the most important things. It's astonishing how good charity could be if we just took it more seriously. If the richest 10% gave 10% of their incomes to charity, what could we do? Well, that would be $4 trillion a year. Jeffrey Sachs estimates that it would cost $175 billion a year for 2 decades to solve global poverty forever. That would be less than 5% of the money we'd have. What would we do with the other 95%? Well, if 10% gave 10%, this is my quick breakdown of what spending could look like in the first year. In fact, if 10% gave 10%, the first year would give us enough to eliminate extreme poverty and hunger, eradicate all neglected tropical diseases and many others besides, triple medical research, give everyone secondary education, permanently save every rainforest in the world, get us well on the way to fixing climate change, fund an unparalleled renaissance in the arts, and have enough left over to launch several manned missions to Mars. That would be the first year. Goodness only knows what we do in year 2. How can we make this happen? Luckily, there are some simple answers. Give more. Give more effectively. And encourage others to do the same. There's a growing movement called effective altruism, which is about this idea of using the resources available to each one of us, our time, our skills, our money, to do as much good in the world as possible. For example, GiveWell undertakes detailed, rigorous research in order to locate the world's best charities, like SCI. I highly recommend you visit GiveWell next time you make any decision about charitable giving. And another example, there's an organisation called Giving What We Can. And this organisation has a pledge that over 1,000 people have taken, myself included. A pledge to give 10% of your lifetime income to those organisations you believe can most effectively use it to help improve the lives of others. When I first heard about this, it seemed like a big, kind of scary commitment to make, but If I earn a usual sort of graduate starting salary of 25,000 a year and give away 10%, I'll still be in the richest 5% of the world. And all the evidence suggests that giving money to charity makes you happier than spending it on yourself. I believe we can create a society where giving 10% isn't this kind of weird, unusual commitment, but something that everybody does, just as part of being a normal, decent person, where within a few years, things like poverty and illiteracy and environmental problems will be things of the past, and where we have this huge pool of resources dedicated to fixing any problems that might remain. That's a world I'd be proud to live in. Help me make that world happen. Thank you.
Okay, so I think the speaker does an excellent job of providing an overview of the rationale for effective altruism, as well as sort of highlighting the ways that effective altruism can be utilized or implemented in the wider world. So with this being said, and this is a natural extension of, the Declaration of Human Rights, et cetera, as we saw. But what do you think of effective altruism, right? Is it pie in the sky or a viable way to live your life? What are some of the benefits and downsides? Do you think we should follow this ethic? And do you think 10% is enough? So these are some of the questions that you could tarry with, engage with in the discussion forum, or later today in class as well. But effective altruism is a radical new position, but there's a growing movement behind it. But again, as we discussed, we have 3 frameworks, right, concerning the way that we answer, do we have a duty to help? And this is very much founded on one framework. Is this the framework that you endorse? And if so, why? So again, do we have a duty to help? So the final discussion that we'll be having on Friday, we'll be discussing Ebola and the Ebola outbreak. And I have 2 videos. The first video basically discusses what Ebola is. The second video is sort of a behind the scenes as a medical professional, Doctors Without Borders, helping to mitigate in Ebola pandemics. Thank goodness it is not airborne, because the death rate is quite high. At least with full treatment and whatnot, they've gotten it down to 40%. However, without effective treatment within the first 24 hours, the death rate spikes. So the questions that I want the class to answer and that we'll be discussing are the following at the end of class. Do we have a duty to help? What would each framework say? Remember, we have national frameworks. We have contract theory framework, social contract theory, and we have cosmopolitan frameworks as espoused by Singer. But do we have a duty to help? Should healthcare workers be given preferential treatment when infected? Because in many situations, such as Ebola outbreaks, healthcare professionals are. But that brings up a lot of ethical issues, right? Should healthcare workers be able to opt out of providing care? As we saw in one of the videos, well, as was highlighted, I should say, in one of the videos, some healthcare workers in infected zones were opting out of providing care. Is that acceptable? Is that a violation of professional ethic? But what about your duty to your family, etc.? Do we have a duty to help when dealing with healthcare scarcities at home? In the current contexts, where we are facing healthcare scarcities across the states, and we're weighing that. How do we weigh our duty to help citizens with our duty to help those outside of national boundaries? And should that matter? Should that matter? So these are, again, I'll leave you with these questions. They're important questions to engage with. Well, thank you guys very much. I hope that you have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I will see you when you get back. Also, remember to look over the final assignment so that you can get started on that before the end of the semester. So I hope you have a great day. Take care.